Now, sometimes when writing an if statement, you want to combine conditions. There's not just one condition which has to be met to execute some code, but maybe two. Or you got two alternative conditions. So let's say we have three conditions in our code that should be met in an if statement. The first one is that name is equal to Max. The second is that the age is 30. And the third one is that the isAdmin flag is set. So this could be a Boolean value which is set to true. For this user, it's always set to true, for example. Now, maybe you want to combine these conditions. Maybe you want to say, if condition A is met and B is met, then I want to execute the code. Alternatively, if the user is an admin, I don't care about A and B, so I always want to execute some code if isAdmin is true. So then you could say A and B should be met together, hence the AND, or condition C is met, and translate it into code that you can write in JavaScript, and is represented with the double ampersand operator, or is represented by the double pipe operator. So in that case, the condition A and B would be evaluated together, and only if both yield true, this combined condition here yields true, and the alternative with the OR is evaluated separately. And therefore, this overall condition, where you combine these three conditions together, would only yield true if part 1 or part 2 yields true. So if isAdmin is true, the code would always run, no matter which age or name you have. If isAdmin is false, then you would only run the code if the name is Max and the age is 30, for example. So if then both A and B are true, then you wouldn't care about C. If C is true, you don't really care about A and B. That's how this concrete example here would work. Now, sometimes you also want to combine conditions differently. You don't want to have A and B combined. Instead, you maybe want to say, if condition A is true and either B or C is true, which is not how this currently would be evaluated, but if you would want to say this, then you can always use parentheses around your conditions to control that. So let's have a look at that. For that, back in our calculator, let's say here, we do check for add, subtract, multiply, and divide, right? Now the problem is, if calculate result should be called with any other value, which of course it isn't here in our code, but let's say we're sharing this code with a colleague, and this colleague tries to run this with just a value of div instead of divide, because he thinks that's all that works, then our code currently would break, right? If I call this with div here, and I have, let's say, 5, and then I want to divide this by 2, then you see the result isn't updated, and here, indeed, I get an invalid output. Now, this is the case because div is not a case handled here. Now, maybe we don't want to change the logic how we handle that here, but we want to make sure that we don't try to create an output or write to a log if we meet none of these values. So then we could add another if statement here, which executes totally standalone, detached from the other if statements, so they don't work together magically or anything like that. But here we could check if calculation type is not equal to add, and now the double ampersand operator, calculation type also is not equal to subtract, and calculation type, and now I'm running out of space. So what we can do is we can auto format, and this automatically splits this across multiple times. You can absolutely do that. You can write all these conditions combined in one line, or you split them in multiple lines. You don't have to split after the ampersand operator. That's just a recommendation. This code would also be valid, but it's harder to read. So therefore, this is what my auto formatting tool gives me. It auto formats like this. You can generally format in whichever way you want, but this also is a syntax, a coding style, which you will find in many other resources. So it's the one I will use. So now here, I also add another condition. If calculation type is not equal to multiply, and last but not least, if calculation type also is not equal to divide, then we know we have none of the values we're checking up here. So then we maybe don't want to execute this code, and therefore here what we can do in this block is we can return. Remember, if you call return, if you use the return keyword in a function, that means that this function returns a value. Doesn't really matter to us here. We don't expect a value, we don't store it, we don't do anything with it. But it also means that code after the return statement is not executed. And this is indeed a common pattern that you check some condition, and if it's not met, you know, running this function, running the rest of this function doesn't make sense because it won't work with the values you're giving me, and therefore you might want to return. Hence, we could also grab this if statement and put it right to the top of this. This means that if calculation type is not one of the values we support down there is no sense in continuing with this function, so we return right away, and therefore the other code won't even execute. If, on the other hand, you have a calculation type that is add or subtract or multiply or divide, then you would continue, because this total condition here only yields true if every subcondition yields true, because we combine them with an AND. So this means only if it is not add, and not subtract, and not multiply, and not divide, only then we return. If it is subtract, well then this here is returning false because we're checking for it not being equal. So this would return false if it is subtract, if calculation type is subtract. And therefore this whole condition would return false, and therefore this code wouldn't run, and we would continue with the next lines. So this is how that works and how we can combine conditions. In this case with the AND operator. But of course, in other cases, you might be interested in the OR operator because you also have multiple conditions where one of them should be met. Actually, we could rewrite this with the OR operator by checking for equality. We could say if calculation type is equal to add, so now I'm not checking for inequality but for equality, or calculation type is equal to subtract, or, and now again, I'll structure this across multiple lines here to make it a bit easier to read. And now here, I'll check if calculation type is equal to multiply, or if calculation type is equal to divide. So now if any of these is true, this entire condition will return true. So if the calculation type is multiply, this will return true. The others will return false, but this returns true, and therefore this whole condition will return true. Because with OR, the whole condition returns true if one of the subconditions returns true. With AND, the whole condition only returns true if all subconditions return true. Here, one of them suffices. So here we make it into the if block if at least one of them is true, and therefore now we could take all that code here and remove it from there, and instead move it into this if block, and therefore this code would only execute if one of these conditions is met. This means we can now remove this check, comment it out for example, because now we're checking for the opposite. Now typically you would want to use this approach here, however, because now we have a lot of code nested into the if block, which can make it a bit harder to read and understand. So therefore checking this instead of having this if statement here makes more sense, but technically you could use both, and this also shows you how you can use AND or the OR operator, and it's of course needless to say that you can also combine them in one condition if you have AND and OR in one condition. So now with that, if I show this to you, with that added, you see that now if I try to divide by 2, we get nothing down there. It doesn't change because this entire function doesn't even execute, because we return here if we pass in a calculation type that's not one of these 4 values. And in this case, I do pass in div here, which is not one of the 4 values, hence we don't continue. If I change this back to divide here, you will of course see that now if we reload here, and now we divide, this works again. So this is how you can use the AND and OR operators to combine conditions.